And we came after that to the crippled children in the metal workshops, and there were young ones upon whose lips the milk of their mothers was scarce dried, boys and girls that sat with hammers in their hands, and fashioned into vessels the copper and bronze and silver drawn from the furnace. And these children had upon their bodies the burned-in marks of their slavery, even like their parents, and the decree was upon their flesh to use up their strength in slavery, till they fell among the heaps of dung, even as their parents did. And some of them were nigh to blindness, and some had had their faces burned by fire, for that they were not skilled enough. And the flesh of others was torn by the whips of their overseers, for they that sat by the furnaces were unfit any more for the lusts of the Zidonians. Therefore their bodies received no care, nor were they good to be sold in the slave markets. Therefore they were gathered together in the forges, that they might end their young lives in this labor. Then we saw how young hands touched fire, as if they were not flesh, but iron pincers. We saw children with bellies swollen high from much drinking of water against the great heat, and the water which they drank was the unclean standing water which they used for the cooling of the wheels. And we went forth from this place to the place of the great furnaces. There we saw the slaves bring in woven baskets the loads of lead earth which the ships had brought from Britain. And the furnaces stood upon the seashore, filled with the fires of hell. And they cleansed the lead earth, and mixed it with iron and silver from the mines of Tarshish. And others nourished the flames of the ovens with loads of wood, which they brought in wagons from the Carmel. And about the fires, which beat from the furnaces, danced naked men, half concealed in the clouds of thick smoke, which poured from the ovens and darkened the light of the sun. And in the midst of the heat and smoke, the naked were like sinners in hell, and they moved about, and with long shovels they poured the molten lead into the molds, and they drew these forth and felt them with their hands. And it came to pass that the boiling metal spurted from the molds, and fell upon their bodies, and burned them. And we saw there cripples with burned-off limbs and half-faces, and when they would turn from the work, they were driven with whips into the smoke and flames by the overseers that stood about them. And when the spurting metal took out the eyes of the slave, he was taken away and put to work on the dye mills. And when a slave could no longer labor at the dye mills, then they found other work for him, and there was no ceasing and no flight from work, until death took pity on them, as it was with our forefathers in Egypt. And we went forth and came to the place of the glass blowers, and here too great fires burned in ovens, and their flames went up to heaven. And these fires likewise were fed with loads of wood which the slaves brought down from the Carmel and Lebanon. And here, likewise, slaves dragged heavy baskets of glass sand, as our parents dragged loads in Egypt, and the glass sand, which is found here on the shore, is poured into the furnaces, and becometh a glassy fluid. But in this place there worked not strong men, but women and children even more, such as were young of breast, and that had much breath in them to blow through pipes into the hot glass stuff. And there were children fleshless to the bone from the great heat of the ovens, and charred limbs as among the metal workers. And they pulled forth blazing glass from the cauldrons on their pipes, and their lips were fast to the pipes, and they blow into the fiery stuff, and the breath of their breasts hollowed out the glass vessels. And while the fire was in the stuff, they formed it with their naked fingers into the beaks and necks and ornaments of the vessels. And it was so that the sun burned their bodies from without, and the hotness of the stuff burned their inward parts. And it came to pass that here and there a child fell under the burden of the fiery work, and being carried away from the ovens, he came under the eye of an overseer. And if there was still life in the child, the overseer awakened him with the lash. And if there was no more life in him, he was thrown upon the dung heaps by the sea, and became the prey of the sea birds. And it chanced that as we stood by the glass furnaces, they carried forth a child that had fallen from the heat, and they laid it upon a heap of glass sand under the sun. And one of the overseers looked at the child, then let fall upon it the rain of leaden riders of his whip. And when, after a while, the child did not waken under the whip, then the overseer let it lie there, for the soul had departed from the child, and there was no more worth in it. And there was none there to take the part of the child. And our rabbi stood there and looked upon the thing, and we thought in our hearts that now he would lift up his hand, and he would change the overseer, as Lot's wife had been changed, into a pillar of salt. Or he would do as Moses had done when he smote the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. For we beheld the face of the rabbi when he gazed upon the child, and it was as if a fire had come into it, and he trembled as if a storm had passed through him. But he said naught to the slayer of the child, and his lips were locked, and the line of his mouth was twisted in pain. So we too were silent. And Yochanan, the son of Zebedee, smote with his fist upon his own heart, wherein his rage burned. And the other disciples too were seized with anger against the slayer, and we longed that the rabbi might utter a word, and make the slayer sink into the sands, even as he had made the child to sink into death. But our rabbi was still silent, and we understood there was a reason for his silence, and we contained our anger. But when the slayer had left the child, then the rabbi drew near to the dead body, and we with him. And he looked down upon the dead child, and it was a boy, in his 9th or 10th year, and his body was withered with the heat, so that there was no flesh upon it, but it was wholly bones with skin thereon, and the skin was covered with sores and boils. And one leg was lame, and he had but one eye, for which reason they had put him to the ovens. But he bore in his right ear the sign of his mother's love, the earring which she put in his ear when he was born. And his hair was black, and his face was not the face of a child, but hard and extinguished, like that of an old man, and full of wrinkles. And we waited, thinking that the rabbi would have compassion on the little one, and awaken him from the sleep of his death. But he did not so. And we understood that there was a reason for this, and we asked not. And our rabbi was silent, but I marked that the tears ran from his eyes and fell upon the body of the child. And we went from the valley of the pain of children, and we came to the place where they keep their slaves when they are brought from the ships which come from all the lands of the world. And this was a hedged place upon the shore, covered with palm leaves. And there we beheld the men and women and children, the old and the young, of all the races of the earth, and there were mothers with children at the breast. And the Zidonians get not their slaves by the conquest of the sword, as other nations do, but by traffic in souls. They follow after the captains and commanders and buy their prisoners, and they go wherever the sword of Rome reacheth, to the isles of Britain, and to the lands which are beyond the deserts of Africa, and Armenia, and the Caucasus. And they buy also the slaves of the lands which neighbor on their own. And they put the slaves in groups and classes. Some they send to the mines in the far-off lands of Spain and Britain, whence they bring silver, lead, and iron. These be the slaves which are condemned to look no more on the light of the sun, for they are held forever in the mines, and are not released from their living graves. And these are, for the most part, the strongest men in the best years of their life. And there were such now upon the shore, and they kneeled in chains, hard by one another, and their eyes were fixed upon the sun, as knowing what would be their lot, and seeing to take with them into the everlasting darkness as much of the sun as they might now gather. And there were other slaves who would pass their lives upon ships, and still others there were whose lot was fixed according to the trades which they had known in their homes. And yet again there were some, young and fresh of body, to be sold upon the markets of Zidon, and to be taken to markets beyond the seas, to serve the lusts of their buyers. And they were all sorted and set apart, and treated according to their worth upon the markets, and so their food was. Those that were strong of body and enduring were set aside for coarse labors, and they were fed with raw foods, with carcasses and stinking fats, and they were placed under the lash. But those that were destined for house use and for lusts were treated gently. They were kept under shelter, and their food was tender, and the overseers guarded them from harm, lest their worth be diminished. And we saw an owner of slaves cry out in rage against an overseer, for that he had lifted his whip against goodly young slaves, and diminished the worth of the merchandise. And such slaves they anoint with oils, that they shall awaken desire, and their price be higher. And our rabbi stood there a long time, and looked upon the lines of slaves, for he would hear and see all. And that day he ate no bread, but he was as if sated with the pain of those he looked upon. And we knew that something was toward in his heart. And again I heard him groan as if a storm had gone through him, and he was seized by a great anger. I had not seen him thus in all the days I had been with him, for fire went out of his eyes, and his body was like a red flame, and he called out, "Thrice unclean art thou, Tyre. Thy flesh is the flesh of corpses, and thy water is poured out blood." And he went from there, and we came into the heart of the city, and we sat down in an open place, for our rabbi would not enter into a house, the roofs of Zidon being unclean, as if death dwelt under them. And he would not eat their bread, for the bread of Zidon is the flesh of corpses, and the water thereof is as poured out blood. He would only endure the night there, and return to the borders of the land of Israel, for their manners and customs were strange to us, and we were as lost in the midst of the tumult of their pain and sin. And the city, girdled with the sin of the torture of men, was in appearance like a harlot, colored and raddled. Their gold was pressed from the blood of men, and their wealth from the sweat of the young. Their houses were strong built, with columns and broad steps and ornamented roofs like unto temples. And in every open place they had temples for the abominations of their idols. And we saw the passing of many people, and they were clad in many-colored clothes. And the more important the man, the more were the colors of his dress, ornamented and many-hued, like unto the plumage of wild birds, and with golden circlets upon their heads. And their wives too were adorned in multicolored raiment, and they went accompanied by slaves who were naked, with their shame exposed, and the city was filled with song and play. And we encountered time without number, bands of celebrants proceeding to or from their sinful gatherings, accompanied by the music of flutes, and the men like the women were prinked and rouged, and naked slaves went with them, so that Tyre uncovered her shame to the light of heaven. And our rabbi with his disciples, garbed in black, were gathered together, and sat in a heap in the corner of a palace, beneath a palm tree, and we closed our eyes that we might not see their indignity. And they remarked by our clothes, which differed from theirs, that we were strangers, yet not one of them drew near to us to entreat us to his home, as is the custom in the blessed land of Israel, where the fear of God lieth upon us. And though there was peace since our fathers' times between Tyre and us, and there was commerce between the two lands, nevertheless none looked round upon us. Here in the city of Tyre, we the disciples perceived how far the Gentiles be from us, and we approached none of them, for that they would not have comprehended our ways, and they would have mocked us. Here in this strange place we perceived at last how holy is Israel, and how well it is with us that God hath made his Spirit to rest upon us, and that instead of being the slaves of men of flesh and blood, we were elected to be the children of the Lord of the world, and we longed to be among our brothers in the bosom of the Jewish law of the Torah, whereunder we are warmed as under the wings of our Father, who keepeth watch over us. And as we sat thus lost in the alien city of the Gentiles, there approached us a man, and his garb was black and simple like ours, and he asketh us in our tongue, Brothers, surely you are children of Israel, that you pass the night in the street, and enter not into the houses of the heathen? And we answered, So it is, we are brothers in Israel. And the stranger called to us and said, Blessed be the God of Israel, that he hath sent my brothers unto me. Now be ye gracious unto me, and enter under my roof. Blessed will be the threshold of my house, that you cross it. I have bread in my house, also wine, which is ritually pure according to the laws of Israel. And my wife, the keeper of my house, rejoiceth already, and my household likewise, that such important guests be come. And he rejoiced with us, and kissed us each on the cheek, as is the custom in Israel. And we, with great rejoicing, accompanied him to his home.